delighted to be talking to you today, Dahr.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been reading your articles and reading your book, and I know one of your history before you start reporting on the environment is that you were actually a social worker, and then you went from there to Iraq and to report as an unembedded journalist on the impact on the Iraqi people, and from there, to now to talking about the environment. But I'm interested in what takes you to Iraq and what takes you to reporting about the environment.
So I was living in Alaska at the time, and I'd moved up there in 1996. And to preface the social work was I essentially moved up there because of love of mountains. And I'm from Texas originally, and for some weird reason I didn't understand at the time, I always had this thing for mountains. And so I went up to Alaska and saw Denali for the first time in 1995 it was, and it was love at first sight. So I basically just reoriented my entire life to, I'm going to move to Alaska and I'm going to climb. And I just wanted to be in the mountains. And I didn't really understand it. I just knew it was there, so I followed it. So I went up there and I had different jobs, a couple of them as doing various forms of social work. And that's what I was doing when I wasn't up on Denali climbing, where in the summers I worked as a guide for a while and then doing volunteers with the Park Service up there doing rescues. And during the lead up to the Iraq War, 2003, that summer actually, right when it was launched, I, like so many people, were flabbergasted by what happened and was outraged and didn't know what to do. The normal means of expressing political dissent obviously were abject failures all the way around, and the war happened anyway. And even though everybody knew it was grossly illegal and immoral. And I remember being on Denali and listening to radio reports at night in my tent about what was happening in Baghdad, and I was outraged. And I just had this very clear message that you just need to go. You just need to go to Iraq and write about it. And so that's what I did. I just followed basically what was brought to me to go do.
So you weren't a reporter at the time?
No, I had written essentially a couple of different articles about mountaineering stories, mountaineering trips that I'd been on. But no, I was not a reporter.
So there's something about that I find quite exciting, that you followed an impulse, that you went there. You ended up writing 3 books about the experience, yeah, and then and quite a bit of recognition from that. Not that you got that at the beginning of that. I know anyone reporting that wasn't coming from the mainstream was very ostracized at the beginning of that. So then you come from there. So what makes you then change focus to start writing about the environment?
Right. So all through my time working as a war reporter, I was acutely aware of what was happening with the climate crisis. I mean, living in Alaska since 1996 and getting into mountaineering, straight away I was faced with it. Receding glaciers, crazy weather patterns, no snow on the ground in Anchorage through Christmas, one of the years I was there. Just, front lines of the crisis then, just as the Arctic is now. And so I was very aware of it and very troubled by it. And then, of course, I go to Iraq, and there's this basically 7-year period of essentially working as a war journalist. And then I always knew, though, I wanted to come back into environmental journalism, and then more specifically the climate crisis. And so in 2010, the BP oil disaster happened in the Gulf of Mexico. And having grown up in Houston and spent some of the better days of my childhood in Galveston, that felt like a personal affront to me. I really cared about the Gulf of Mexico. And so I went there to report on it. And then that ultimately became my segue into climate journalism. I reported real heavily on the BP spill for a couple of years, and then during which time I got hired by Al Jazeera English and started writing primarily about the climate crisis.
And you obviously wrote the book, The End of Ice. One of the things that you do that I loved in your book is you go around to many of the hotspots, many of the environmental hotspots, and you speak to people on the ground there, you speak to scientists on the ground, you speak to some indigenous people, you speak to people that have lived there for many years. And one of the places that you wrote about, which you've already mentioned, was Denali. And you described it in your book as the closest thing you had to a church. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious about the changes that you've seen at Denali, mm-hmm. and why you described it like that.
Well, I really focus heavily on Denali because it's my favorite place on the planet. And I start the book and end the book on Denali. And so obviously wanted to write in depth about the dramatic changes that I had seen up there. And I wanted to write about it from a place that was very personal also because I love the place. And I really, when I wrote the book, I wanted to try to bring that into everywhere I went. Denali is the easiest because it's my favorite, but all these other spectacular, majestic, amazing places, and I think we could say that about the entire planet, but just talking about these very obvious places that are so easy to be in awe of, because I think our disconnect from nature, us being industrialized humans, is the core of the problem. And so I really wanted to bring that to people, to try to help people that maybe don't get out in nature at all, like remember, like look at where we live and look at what's happening to it and look at what is going to happen as this progresses to all of us. And so Denali, starting there, I had been there in 2003, and then when I worked on the book, I was back there in 2016. And in just 13 years, dramatic changes. Being up there and looking up at slopes of other mountains in the the broader Alaska range there, and seeing big swaths of earth that were now bare, that used to be covered with glacier, and parts of that even spreading across the mountain. And and this is a place not that far from the Arctic Circle, and you're very, very high up. Even at base camp on Denali, you're at 7,200 feet, and crazy things like being up there as a volunteer with the Park Service. We had to follow Park Service guidelines, so things like we had to wear helmets, which was something that on Denali we never used to have to do before, and we had to do that because of rock fall. And that was happening because blue ice with rocks in it, high above the route, was melting. And so we had to now worry about rock fall, even up at places like Denali Pass, which is over 18,000 feet high. And that was something that we never had to do even 13 years before that. Other things like anecdotal stories like lightning storms up on the summit ridge. Again, just it's too cold. That never used to happen. Now that's changing. Things like mosquitoes down at base camp. That also had never happened before. And then the ranger that I went on patrol with when I was up there working on my book had told me that he remembers one of the stories where he had gone down to do a rock climb not too far from base camp up off the glacier. And he went down to this particular area and went down again several years later to do the same rock climb. And he was trying to find where the access point onto the climb from the glacier, and he couldn't find it. And then he looked up and it was like 30 feet up. And it's because that's how much ice had already been lost in just the amount of time that he'd been going up there. So on a human time scale, not a geologic time scale. And that's what happened. That was confirmed when I interviewed Mike Loso, a glaciologist up in Alaska also, and had studied the Kahiltna Glacier, which is the main glacier you go up on the standard route. And he said, yes, we've lost just this glacier alone, at least 30 feet of mass. And when you're talking about a glacier 30, 40 miles long, in some areas almost a mile wide, that's an enormous amount of ice.
And I think there is a thing when we talk about the loss of ice, and certainly in the Arctic, there is a thing where people are hearing this information, but it's a bit abstract in some ways. I know in your book you've said our fate is actually tied to what happens there. Even this idea of, oh, if the Arctic melts, then we'll go drill there, or there'll be a passage through. What does it actually mean? What does it mean for us, the melting Arctic?
Well, it is easy to, especially for most of us that don't live up in the Arctic, or that don't live directly within eyesight of a glacier, or that aren't directly reliant upon that for our immediate drinking water needs, for example. It's easy to kind of think, oh, well, it's far away, and yeah, it'll be a tragic loss, but whatever, like life will go on. It won't. No, life won't go on if we lose ice at the rate that we're losing it now, and this continues into the future, which it is going to. For example, in the Arctic, there's so many different ways we can come at this, but the loss of the Arctic sea ice is overtly going to be one of the most catastrophic consequences of the crisis. So the sea ice is protecting the shallow Arctic seabeds from getting too warm, and that ice is shrinking at record rates. And as the sea ice shrinks, it exposes more blue water, which absorbs more solar radiation and heat. And then the shallow Arctic seabeds are basically covered in subsea permafrost. And within that subsea permafrost are frozen methane hydrates. And this is a greenhouse gas, methane, that is 100 times more potent than CO2 on a 10-year time scale. And it's already starting to release. The only question is, how fast does it go? And do we start to see some of these abrupt cataclysmic releases on a broad scale, which one scientist, Natalia Shikova, has warned about in studies that she's published, peer-reviewed studies. And so that's already starting to happen. The only question is, when does it start to really accelerate? Other losses of ice that are of great concern, obviously Greenland, as we just saw this past summer, and we're seeing record melting rates of Greenland, like cataclysmic amounts of ice melting and going into the oceans, and so sea level rise. So a huge consequence of the melting ice from Greenland and Antarctica specifically, which are right now the two single biggest contributors to sea level rise, with the melting of the ice that's happening there. We're looking at right now, one scientist I interviewed for my book, Dr. Harold Wanless, said we are looking at over 100 feet of sea level rise that right now is already baked into the system. So that means if we stopped all CO2 emissions on a dime and did all the mitigation efforts we can possibly dream of,
Which we're not
even starting,
Yeah.
that even if we had, we're still looking at 100 feet of sea level rise, at least. And there's several other scientific studies that show anywhere from that to 60 feet to 130 feet. Just pick your poison. Point is, even if it's on the lower end of that, that means every coastal city on the planet is gone right now. So those are some of the overt things that will happen as we keep losing ice. Other issues, like as far as glaciers go, because I have a whole chapter also just on glaciers in the book, and the two angles on that from a human-centric perspective. Right now, as we speak, a minimum of 250 million people on the planet, glaciers are their sole source of drinking water. So with no terrestrial glaciers, and it looks like we're on a path now globally that we could have no terrestrial glaciers by 2100. And in a lot of areas, it's essentially guaranteed, like the lower 48 United States, where we're talking from. We have the Olympic Mountains right over here. We have the Cascades, heavily glaciated areas. That there's a couple of different studies that show now that by 2100, at current rates, assuming they don't accelerate, which is a false assumption, but let's assume that, still probably by 2100, there will be no glaciers here. So irrigation water for farming, groundwater, our wells, where are we going to get water, right? So this is a huge problem. And then on a broader scale, the Hindu Kush region of the Himalaya, other studies that have come out this year, one last year actually, show that area, which is the source of several main rivers in Asia, where 1.5 billion people get their drinking water and irrigation water, they are on track right now where most, if not all of that ice could be gone by 2100. So where do those 1.5 billion people go? Because you can't live somewhere where there's no water. And so where do they go? And then what happens in those areas? Where's all the water going to come from for all of those people? Food, shelter, housing, jobs, etc. And so you can kind of see where this is going.
I mean, it's interesting talking to you just personally, because often in the conversations I'm in, I'm speaking in this kind of way to other people. But to receive it, I can still, even with my head in it all, I can still feel the shock come through. Even when it's not a shock to me, it's still a shock to me.
Yeah.
And I want to go back. I mean, look, there's so many. So essentially, the melting Arctic has so many implications,
Right.
you know, aside from the feedback loop that it creates. But I picked up on something you said around the 2100, yeah? Mm-hmm. And there's something about when we throw out these time frames, I think it throws people into a sort of stupor in a sense. Oh, well, it's outside my lifetime, you know? Even when we go as far as 2050 and we say, oh, well, this could happen by 2050, this could happen by 2100, I feel like, I more feel like the future's now, you know? There's things happening now. And I know, like the IPCC report, for example, you know, this whole thing, we've got 12 years to turn it around. Just talk about timeframes and also that IPC report around timeframes.
No, I'm really glad that you bring that up. And I too sometimes make the mistake of citing, oh, by 2100 or by 2050, and because that's what the study, I'm basically just citing studies that's what they do. And so it's very easy to kind of fall into this line of thinking and talking that still puts the crisis out in the future. Because right now, the most important thing I try to remember to talk about is that it's happening right now. And this idea that we still have time to turn this around is just patently untrue. And I think if you bring up the IPCC, one of the biggest problems that agency has, or that political organism that poses as a scientific organism has caused is last fall they released the report that says, well, we have 12 years to make the changes we need to make to avert catastrophic climate change impacts. And there was no new data in that report. I'm glad that they sounded an alarm bell. It's very good to bring as much public attention to this crisis as possible, but we have to be very clear about the fact that there was no new data in that report. It was all based on things that they had already released in the previous IPCC assessment, which are only come out every 7 years. And that means we have to go back to the fact that the IPCC, there's been studies actually within the last few months to confirm this, consistently downplays the crisis in the language. It's a heavily politicized organization. I've actually had several IPCC authors that I've spoken with, a couple of them in the book, tell me firsthand that, yeah, these are even our worst case projections are lowball.
So and these are the people that have written the report.
These are authors, IPCC authors, that even our worst case projections are lowball. Because countries that are the biggest polluters, like the United States, like Russia, like India, weigh in and use political leverage to keep the worst case projections from being higher than they already are. Coupled with the fact that, as I mentioned, their assessments only come out every 7 years. A lot of the data in them can be as much as 10 years old before those are even published, on top of being heavily politicized.
So that data could be 17 years old, essentially, by the time it makes it into a report.
Just about,
yes.
Right. Some of it could be. And the fact is that things are happening so fast now that even a scientific study that is done rapidly and edited and peer-reviewed and published as quickly as possible, you're still looking at, like, I think best case scenario, probably a 2 to 3 year time frame. And the second that study hits publication, it's out of date. Because we know how fast things are happening now. That this is why scientists are always alarmed, and they're always talking about unprecedented changes, and they can't use strong enough adjectives to describe it, because they are the ones acutely aware of, like, look, this is way far ahead of what we thought it would be. I mean, one example is one of the previous IPCC assessments had stated that when you looked at their worst case projections for Arctic sea ice loss, it was that worst case projection for this year, we're ahead of it. I mean, you don't have to take my word for it. Just look at the actual older IPCC projections and you'll see we're ahead of on several areas. And the last thing that I think it's important to add on this is that I've had an IPCC author tell me on condition of anonymity that you can take all of our worst case projections and double them.
Yeah. Just have to take a minute to absorb that. That's strong.
It is, and
Yeah.
it's one thing to know that in our head. And you mentioned earlier being shocked
Yeah.
of like, because I know we've talked, and I know that you know this data, all if not most, if not all of it already. But I think it's a good thing that we're shocked every time that we hear it, because when you really understand what this means, and we have to be adults about this. We have to understand that we are going into a period now where, and I say we, meaning those of us in the bubble of the West that still have electricity and food and water and still can get in our cars and drive and do these things, and that's all a very temporary situation where we already have large swaths of the world that either never had that or have already lost it. Case in point right now, the Bahamas, and so again, it's back to that future tense talking versus right now. And so it's easy to kind of fall into this lull of a future tense of this stuff. But if you're in Paradise, California or the Bahamas, you're already post-apocalyptic, and you're basically looking at, should I even try to rebuild here? Probably not. Probably doesn't make sense. Then where do you go? What do you do there? How is that going to work? What country is going to welcome you, et cetera, et cetera. We have to understand there's already millions of people living in that world.
So you went to the Amazon, and the Amazon has some resonance for me, and for everybody really. But certain of my practices take me towards thinking about the Amazon. And you met with a guy there, Thomas Lovejoy, who's you call him the godfather of biodiversity. So what did you find talking to him and seeing the Amazon? I mean, the Amazon's in the news a lot now for a start. So
yeah. So Dr. Lovejoy, I was absolutely honored and privileged to get to go to the Amazon and go to Camp 41, the most famous of several study camps that he set up. This is a guy who's been studying the Amazon since 1965. He's been on several presidential science advisory committees. He's been with the Smithsonian. It would take you quite a while to read his resume, we'll put it that way. He's authored several books, numerous peer-reviewed studies, and is absolutely one of the leading experts of the Amazon, hands down, unarguable. And I got to go really taste and feel what it's like to be in really that kind of a center of biodiversity, and really what it means. And you've been there, and you know that. And it was my first time to get to go, and probably only. And literally within minutes of getting to Camp 41, just started to feel the forest working on me, like pulling me into it in a really, really good way. Or like another way to put it is like growing up into me. You literally just immediately step into it and become it, and it you. And to the point where it affected my dreams really deeply. Sometimes in very unsettling ways, other times in really, really affirming ways, and just being in constant amazement of the more I learned about it and the biodiversity there and how everything relied on everything else and couldn't exist independently, and the importance of that for all of life on Earth and the critical roles that the Amazon play. It's like 20% of the world's freshwater rivers are in the Amazon. It generates its own rainfall. It impacts climate patterns globally. I mean, such a critical role. And then the number of species there's so much there. And when I talked to Dr. Lovejoy about it, I said, you've been studying this since 1965. We must really know a lot about the Amazon, right? And he said, we don't know anything. We've barely scratched the surface. And this is a guy who's been studying it for more than half a century. So that, coupled with the fact that they're still discovering new species down there on an average of 1.5 new species daily. And while we speak, it's being burned, intentionally allowed to burn by the Bolsonaro government, and so that it can be developed. And literally just last week, a representative from Brazil met with Mike Pompeo of the United States so they can talk about how they're going to develop it. And this is utter insanity that this system that, from a climate crisis perspective, plays such an integral role in sequestering carbon. It pulls so much CO2 out of the atmosphere. And now it is becoming a net source of carbon.
Because of the burning, because of the smoke from the burning.
Because of the burning, because of droughts, because of deforestation, all of this together. And we've already had, there was a drought in 2010 that was so severe in the Amazon that during that drought, that year of that drought, the Amazon released more carbon than the pollution of Russia and China combined. So it's been happening off and on, but now it's at a point where it's all in overdrive. And you know, about a year ago, Lovejoy wrote an article warning that he said, look, we've already lost 5% of the Amazon from deforestation and wildfires, et cetera. And if we lose another 5%, then we could well go over a tipping point where the whole thing turns into savanna, or at least most of it. And we've already lost more than 5% this year just from the wildfires.
The wildfires is a good way to put it. The human-lit fires.
Right, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah, let's be more accurate. Thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, this sense of the hopelessness, and people I know respond to some of your work and some of the work of some other people that I know with this criticism of, well, you're saying something that was going to make everyone give up, and what's the point of that, and how do we hold that, and this can't be true anyway. What do you do when you get criticism like that, or how do you hold that, or how do you hold the position that you're holding?
Well, I have been reporting on this as a journalist as accurately and faithfully as I know how for almost a decade. And I knew that presenting all of this in my book would be deeply unsettling to people, and that's why my book has 21 pages of citations. And so it's a classic, you know, when I'm attacked or accused of being, you know, promoting hopelessness or something like this, I'm just the messenger. So it's the classic "don't shoot the messenger, please" situation for me as a journalist. I'm literally just reporting on what scientists tell me and what the scientific studies say. So none of the information that I share is generated by me. I'm just simply reporting what's out there. I've just simply pulled it all into one place in the book. And when you do read it that way, it's very overwhelming and easy to feel despair and hopeless. But as you said, I've been accused often of, you know, being a doomer or, you know, you can't do that. You're going to take away people's hope in this kind of thing.
You've got a nickname as Darmageddon.
Darmageddon
for a while.
was my nickname, working for Al Jazeera English, writing my climate stories. That's right. And unfortunately, the stories that earned me that moniker were, I wish things were as good as they were in those stories now. They you know, things have progressed far along, so much further along than then. But with hope versus hopelessness, I think we're in a situation where what I'm running into in the climate crisis is what I ran into with my Iraq reporting, where even people that were against the war then, they didn't really want the gritty details. Like, they didn't really want to hear in Fallujah about U.S. military snipers funded by their taxpayer dollars were intentionally shooting 14-year-old Iraqi boys between the legs as policy on a regular basis. They didn't really want to hear the details of women and pregnant women intentionally being shot by snipers and ambulances being rocketed by warplanes. And they didn't want those nitty-gritty details. But that's what we have to know. If we want to really take in what's happening and the reality of something that we have a very direct role in, we need to understand the deeper implications of our actions. And so for a long time, my reporting was ignored, even in a lot of lefty publications in the United States. So I could be on an online publication, but not in a print magazine. And needless to say, this is why, of course, the corporate media wouldn't touch me with a 10-foot pole until several years later, by 2006, 2007, when the wheels had completely fallen off in the occupation. It was an abject disaster. Then public opinion changed. And then all of a sudden, it was okay what I reported. but not when I was 3 years ahead of the curve. And I wasn't ahead of the curve. I was just reporting on what was happening. It's just that nobody else was, or very few other people were. Same thing with the climate crisis now. I'm just reporting what the studies are saying. I'm just putting it all together, connect the dots, and here's the situation. So then the question is, yes, it's very scary, and it brings up a lot of despair and a lot of feelings of hopelessness. So is it not our job as adults to process through that, understand that, and now then ask some of the deeper, harder questions of, okay, so now what am I really going to do? And how then shall we live? And how are we going to be during this time? Because when we really look at the situation, as we talked about earlier, there's no more future tense. Like, we are in it now. What's baked into the system, a minimum conservatively of probably 3 degrees C warming already baked into the system.
Because that's held in the ocean, that temperature ocean.
That's right. And with the amount of CO2 that's already in the atmosphere. That's right.
Will continue to heat even if it's stopped.
Even if we stopped everything on a dime. So this whole "we can still save the planet" nonsense is snake oil. And it needs to be called out as such. That people promoting, oh, we still have 10 years or 11 years or 12 years, or we can still do the Green New Deal and this is going to save the planet. This is selling false hope. An analogy that I use with that is, if you go to the doctor because you're sick and he finds out that you have stage 4 cancer and you probably have a year to live, would you rather him not tell you? I would rather him tell me, because I'm going to make very different decisions in my life about how I'm going to use that time, how I'm going to treat people that I care about, how I'm going to talk with people about what I want to do. That's going to be a very, very different situation. And so I get rather agitated at people that are not telling the truth and that are instead saying, well, it's probably not, it could be that, but it's there's still hope. There's going to be this clinical drug come along, or what have you.
Naomi Klein's got a book coming out, sort of, pushing that same idea, of the hope.
Exactly.
And she'll sell 5 million copies, no doubt, or however many. People want to hear that story.
Well, hope is selling well now. And just like someone like Trump as a demagogue has such a strong, adamant following, that people want to be told what to do. And the thing is these are times when each one of us individually now have to decide how we're going to be. If you just find out you have stage 4 cancer and you have a year or less to live, do you want me to tell you what to do? No, you're in a situation now, okay, this is an unprecedented situation for you. And you need to make deeply personal choices about what you're going to do and how you're going to be with this time. And I feel like that's how we are on the planet right now. And that doesn't mean stop fighting. That means if you want to still go dedicate the rest of your life to try to mitigate things, to buy us a little bit of time, to maybe adapt, then please go do that. Absolutely. But each one of us now has to take full responsibility and listen very, very closely, I think, to the earth, and get that message of, okay, this is what's coming up inside, and I'm going to go follow it no matter what the cost and no matter what the risk. And I would actually argue that if you're an activist and that's the route that you feel called to take, that you're going to take the most radical actions you've ever taken in your life. And I think that is the antithesis of people saying, oh, you're going to take away hope, or you're going to cause people to not act. I would argue the opposite. I think that if people really take in deeply the gravity of the crisis that we're in, we could see more radical action than we ever imagined possible.
And hence XR, the birth of that, and the criticism they get because you're causing disruption, you're costing money. Always makes me laugh when I read of those types of things. But certainly when you come into this focus of what do I do or how do I be, I know you have a teacher, a mentor that you're with at the moment, Stan Rushworth, and you're you've come into journalism, but you may actually be, on listening to what to do, you may be going to do something else now. But I'd like to hear about that and your connection with Stan and indigenous wisdom at this time.
Well, as we speak this week, this is what today's Wednesday. 2 days ago, published my last climate dispatch. So I'm finished with journalism. That was it. So I'm now going into a different direction where the only online writing I'm doing for now is co-authoring a column with my dear friend Barbara Cecil titled "How Then Shall We Be?" or "How Then Shall We Live?" which is essentially each one kind of looking at this crisis from a different angle of like the value of elderhood in these times, the importance of working with younger generations during these times, dealing with grief, etc. So we're kind of looking at all these different things that are being brought up by this crisis. But for me personally, through working on the book, which I got the message to do this book by being out in the mountains, and this is why when I've given talks on my book and book readings, I try to leave people with the importance of listening, because dominant Western culture is doing anything but listening. And indigenous wisdom tells us it's all about listening. And so for me, when I was on Denali and got that message to go to Iraq, that wasn't from here. That came up into me while I was up on the mountain because I was listening. And then later, when I was in the mountains, I had this really deep, strong pull to do this book, The End of Ice. I had plans to do another book. I already had a contract to do another book about Iraq. And I literally had to completely change directions and say, no, that's not what's in me to do now. I need to do this book. And so that was from listening. And now I'm at a point now where the book came out in January, and I'm still giving some talks on the book, but I need to do some different writing now. And it's in conjunction, or it's along the lines of, we need to be really listening to the earth, and we need to be really listening to people who that is their culture and that's what they've always done. And so my writing's now taking me more in a direction of indigenous thinking and indigenous perspectives on what's happening. And I can say cursorily up front, the single most important thing is to listen. And I think, again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but right now at this time, each one of us, if we go out and really listen as closely as we can, then I do believe that if we do that the right way, each one of us will get what's ours to do. And in that way, the earth is the organizer. We're not going to have a political organizer. We're not going to have a famous journalist. We're not going to have some leader. No one's going to tell us what to do. All of the systems that brought us to this place are abject failures. Capitalism with a green leaf, which would be the Green New Deal, abject failures.
Even the green movement itself.
Right.
Yes.
It's failed. Let's admit it. And we're on our own. I mean, what government on the planet right now, even in the best case scenario, is coming anywhere close to reacting to this the way that it should be? No one's even starting to come close. So we're on our own. It's up to us, but we're still here. And so are we going to listen and behave appropriately now? Because if not now, when? Because we have a chance right now to go out and listen. And then I truly believe each one of us then get our marching orders, if you will, from the earth. And then the question is, are we going to do what we're told?
Well, it's a very potent question. And I as you say it, I've got voices in the back of my brain from people that I know that have children. And I'm trying to take care of my children. I need to, work out what they're going to do, or for a future for them, or how can I even talk to this about to my children?
Yeah.
When it's just me, I understand. I can listen to that message as well, but I know people are thinking on behalf of young people. What do you feel about that?
I understand. I don't have my own children. That was my own decision to not do that. But I have a niece and nephews, and I have other very close friends with kids that I really care about as well. And I've actually had the opportunity recently to spend a lot more time with folks in younger generations. And for example, I'll use an example of a nephew of mine came up here this summer. He's 16, and I took him on a backpacking trip in the Olympics. And, you know, he's not a political person at all. I mean, he's in a lot of ways a typical 16-year-old who's kind of going to school, just, you know, trying to fit in and this kind of thing, and, you know, struggling with the social pressures and everything that come with that. But what I realized was when we started talking, he already knew. And I think that's what folks my generation and older forget or miss, that he already knew what was going on. I mean, I picked him up at SeaTac, and within 30 minutes he said, you know, I basically said, so, you know, what do you want to talk about? Like, what do you want to do while you're here? And like, why are you really here? Why did you want to come up here? And he just said, I said, you know, what's troubling you at home? You know, and because he came up here for a break. And he said, you know, I've just always had I've had this feeling of imminent doom. And I said, you know, you're having a very normal response to a very abnormal situation. And the point is that he was born into this. And some part of him, even though he's not reading environmental reports, some part of him just knows. And you know, each one of us, given that we're so part of the earth and we're essentially animals, we know, we have this primal response that knows when we're in danger. And these younger generations are born into that. And he's not the only one I've had that experience with. Like, you don't need to convince this kid about the crisis. He already essentially knew the punchline, that we are in it deep and that his future will look nothing like mine when I was that age. And he completely understands that. And so my job then is, how can I support you? And not like I'm going to support you and then you're going to do your thing, but like, okay, I'm here and you come back whenever you want. And when you need a break, I'm at your service. I'm at your service. And, you know, I'm a tool, I'm a resource. Use me, call me anytime you want. And we'll go through this together, you know, and we'll be here in this together. And we're going to have to figure stuff out together. And just be full on honest and not sugarcoat it. Because how much energy are we going to spend talking to younger generations or each other, pretending like things aren't what they are? Let's just admit the truth and then behave accordingly, because we're still here and there's still immense amounts of work that need to be done. And we are absolutely morally obliged to try to save as much as we can and mitigate and buy ourselves time. And, you know, and boiling it all the way down, I got to a point when I was actually in a 3-month writer's residency when I was working on kind of my book outline and I was writing my introduction to the book, and I was trying to find the voice of the book. And I had all this data together, which was a culmination of years and years of reporting and research. And I was completely overwhelmed. I mean, I looked at it in total and it was like, it's over. Why even write the book? We're off the cliff. It's like, why do anything? And a good friend of mine, Nick Terry, out in this small town where I was at the time, is a Zen meditation practitioner and teacher. And he had a class every Tuesday that I would go to and sit. And he'd come over sometimes for coffee. And he came over when I was in that kind of despair. And I said, Nick, why even write the book? And he says, you know, Dahr, if there's one tiny organism in the Amazon that gets to live one more week because you write your book, then it's worth it.
And that sort of sums the whole thing up, doesn't it? There's really, you know, where do you go from there? That's it.
You know, another way to put it, where 5 days ago today, I lost my best friend to cancer. And I got to sit with him, you know, and he did everything he could to fight, and had a big surgery. And then, you know, things started to go south shortly thereafter, and they had him on a breathing mask. And we knew we had extremely limited amount of time with him, you know, like days, if not hours. And we knew he was going to die. He knew he was going to die. And me and his partner and he's quadriplegic, so he had a personal assistant. And we were all there, and we just loved him and talked to him and were with him all the way through it. And it was one of the most amazing, magical times and powerful experiences I've ever had in my life. And, what I just, once I knew, okay, my best friend Dwayne's on the way out, like, do I stop loving him? Do I stop caring for him? Do I stop showing up and doing what I can? No, I mean the opposite. I'm going to show up and be as absolutely present as I can. And that's what I did. And I feel like that's where we are on the planet right now. Like, is it a given that the human species goes extinct? No. Does it look like that's what's going to happen? Very, very, very likely. It's really hard to see that this does not end that way. But we don't know for sure. And so I don't add the "but we don't know for sure" part to give false hope. I add it just because I think we have to have enough humility to say we're this tiny little speck of life on Earth, and we've never been here before. We don't know what's going to happen. We know things are going to get extremely hard and bad, and I think it's a given that billions and billions of people are going to die. Does that mean all the species goes? Who knows? But it means here we are in this moment where we can still love the earth, we can still love each other, and we can still take care of each other, and the earth is best we can. And I think it just brings all of that into focus right now.
That's so beautifully put. That's super. Yes, thank you, Dahr. Thanks. We went straight into the wisdom stuff, which I'm quite pleased about, actually. Do you know what I mean? I had a lot more questions about the science, but it almost doesn't really matter. Like there's so much science out there anyway, you know.
And we covered, some of
the big
the good
stuff,
bits,
didn't we?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah. The Arctic kind of led you in that whole thing.
Yeah,
and
sea level rise.
Beautiful. I'm sorry to hear about your friend, but a beautiful
thank you.
story, and very apt to share my own story for a minute. I had cancer. And coming out of that cancer story, which I thought, I've sort of, maybe I'm going to live, maybe I'm going to die. But when I came out of that, then I could see what was going on in the environment. I could just see there was all the curtains were pulled back. I don't know why that was, I had a little look at death for a moment and then came back and it's like, wait a minute, So I understand. Yeah.
That's another interesting aspect, because I was on a panel on Earth Day in Brooklyn at the Brooklyn Historical Society, and it was moderated by this fellow with National Geographic, and he was definitely mainstream. Like, he was clearly not keen to look at what was actually happening and talk about not even just the worst case projections, but beyond that. And it was a real shame, because it was myself and a Guardian climate journalist who's an excellent journalist, and another New York Times Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who's also an excellent journalist. And he led the panel by asking me, like, wow, your reporting's very extreme. Like, you're really writing about these worst case projections and such. And it says, and he mentioned another fellow who'd been in the Iraq War. And he's now is writing about the climate crisis. And he said, you guys, what is it with war? And it seems like you're about the only guys out there really writing about it in this cataclysmic way that you are. And I've thought about that question a lot after that. And it's just recently I realized, along the lines of what you just said, when you've already essentially died, I've been in several life and death situations, from mountaineering to Iraq, and several times where I should be dead. And when you've already stared death in the face, then I think it predisposes you to just being like, yeah, this is what's happening, and it's a crisis, and we could all go. And I think there's this less aversion to accepting death as part of life. And this is why in my book I include quotes by Stephen Jenkinson, who's made himself famous by writing a book called Die Wise, and the dominant culture's aversion to death, and the dominant culture's aversion to even doing endings. And it's like, that's, I think, what we're up against as part of this hope wall of everything ends.
Yeah, and he does put hope as the enemy of grief is what he says. Yeah.
It's the 4-letter word for people who really understand what's happening and want to feel that and deal with it in a very real way, and just accept that death is part of life. And that death might mean over human death or death of other species or just death of the dominant culture as we know it, which I personally think would be a good thing. So there's different ways we can talk about this, and they don't always necessarily mean, the extremely negative things the way that they're painted.
It does get painted that way because people don't want to look. That's what's going on, and particularly parents, and but also people in privilege. The privilege. They're at the top of the mountain, so why would they want to get off the top of the mountain?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And right now in this time of crisis, hope sells, just like demagoguery sells. If you're a Trump supporter, you want someone to tell you what to do and someone to tell you that it's going to be okay. Or someone, to ignore, in the case of Trump, for example, let's just pretend it's not even happening and deny it. And the left version of that would be geoengineering or technology is going to save us, or we still have 11 years, or the Green New Deal, and all of these are missing the mark.
I mean, just for a moment, let's just stop on the geoengineering for a minute. I know people are... I do have this sense that is going to happen, for like the...
Oh, I think without a doubt. It's already... there's already, I believe it's either Yale or Harvard actually already has a geoengineering division of study. So without a doubt, it's going to be employed.
And for what purpose? I know we're talking about, giving up hope, but is there any hope contained in geoengineering, do you think?
Well, right now, with current technology, there is no technology that exists that can be scaled to the level it would have to be scaled to have effect. So there's that point. There's the second point is even proponents of geoengineering are still saying, look, we need way, way, way more studies. We don't know all the cascading effects of this and long-term effects and unintended consequences. So even ardent supporters, most of them are still very reticent to say, yeah, we should go do this, because they understand, if we go tweak the system now this way, what could happen? And we have to also understand that the climate crisis is essentially geoengineering. We've changed the content of CO2 in the atmosphere and the chemical content of the oceans by acidifying them and warming them. So we've already geoengineered the planet. So now we should do it more? Probably not. Plus, it's also along the lines of that same human versus planet, human versus nature dichotomy that got us into this mess in the first place. Oh, let's just go tweak the planet some more.
I loved what you said about just going to listen to the earth, and the earth being the one that gives the instructions. And the truth of that, it just feels really real. And also your life, that you listen on the mountain, you go to Iraq, you listen, you go to the environment, and now you're listening again. To be giving up journalism, I think you're making a strong statement there about how to move with what you're hearing.
Well, in my decision to leave journalism is that I did what I could. I put everything I had out there. I did my research, and the culmination of all of that is my book. And I have nothing left to add. Yes, there'll be updates as Greenland melts, as parts of Antarctica melt and the Western Antarctic ice sheet collapses, and once the methane bombs start going in the Arctic, we need to know when that happens. So I'm not saying we don't need continued journalism, but I know for me what I could do, I did, and I have nothing else to add to that. And so now my writing is going in a different direction, which is really more focused on how are we going to be now going forward. What is a better way for me now to be a service, to life on Earth? And I personally feel like we have enough information. We don't need more information now at this point to start making the radical decisions that we each individually need to make.
Thank you so much, Dahr. I feel like I feel complete with that. That's really very beautiful. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you. My
yeah,
pleasure.
yeah, yeah.
It's great to talk with you.